Everyone laughed when she dug in front of the house while the others were building. She didn't explain or argue. She just did it her way. When winter came, it became clear who had thought ahead. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Autumn arrived quietly on the plains, without ceremony or warning, the way it always did. One morning, the light felt thinner, the sky slightly higher, and the air carried a restraint that had not been there the week before. The woman noticed it immediately. She had arrived only days earlier, with a small wagon, a few essential possessions, and a patience shaped by years of watching seasons change without asking permission. While others marked time by calendars and rumors from distant towns, she marked it by how the ground felt beneath her boots and how long the dew lingered on the grass after sunrise. The settlement itself was modest, little more than a scattering of homesteads stretched across open land. Each house stood at a respectful distance from the next, close enough to recognize a figure moving in the yard, far enough to live as though no one else were there. Most of the families had been on their claims for several seasons already. They knew the wind, knew how it bent the grass in long waves, knew how it could turn cruel without raising its voice. They also knew their habits, passed from neighbor to neighbor, and rarely questioned. The woman did not challenge those habits aloud. She simply did not follow them. For her first days, she did nothing that looked like preparation. She did not raise a structure or lay out materials. She did not mark foundations with stakes or string. Instead, she walked. She crossed her claims slowly, sometimes more than once a day, following no obvious pattern. In the morning, she walked while the ground still held the night's coolness. In the afternoon, she returned when the sun had worked on the soil for hours. She stopped often, crouching to touch the earth, brushing aside grass, pressing her palm flat against the surface as if listening for something beneath it. From a distance, it might have looked like indecision. From closer up, it was attention. The neighbors noticed, as neighbors always do. They watched from porches and yards, leaning against fence posts, or pausing in the middle of their own work. There was no hostility in their attention, only curiosity sharpened by experience. On the frontier, uncertainty was rarely ignored. A person who delayed building usually did so for a reason, and reasons had a way of becoming problems once the cold arrived. A few offered polite comments when paths crossed, remarks about the weather or the quality of the land. She answered kindly but briefly, never explaining what she was looking for or what she intended to do once she found it. By the end of the first week, the pattern became clear to anyone paying attention. She was not wandering aimlessly. She returned again and again to the same stretch of ground, directly in front of the small structure she had begun using as shelter. It was nothing more than a temporary arrangement, barely deserving the word house, but it stood where she had chosen to stop. The slope there faced the sun, and the wind passed over it differently than it did on the open rise nearby. Even before she touched a shovel, she had decided something important about that place. Others, meanwhile, prepared as they always had. They repaired sheds, reinforced doors, and stacked supplies where they could reach them easily. Conversations carried across yards about how early the frost might come and whether the winter would be harder than the last. These were not anxious discussions, only routine ones, the kind people had when they believed they were ready. The woman listened when such conversations reached her, but she did not join them. Readiness, she understood, was not a matter of agreement. When she finally began to dig, it was without announcement. One morning she stepped outside, took up a shovel, and pressed it into the ground, at a spot no one would have chosen if asked for advice. The soil resisted at first, then yielded, turning over in a clean slice. She worked steadily, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone racing a deadline, but with the rhythm of someone testing an idea against reality. After only a short time, the shallow pit was enough for her to stop. She stood there, breathing evenly, and studied the exposed earth as though it had spoken. That small opening was not meant to last. It was a question, not an answer. She filled it back in and left the ground undisturbed for the rest of the day. But something had settled in her mind, and the next morning she returned with the same shovel and a clearer purpose. This time, she did not stop after the first few inches. She dug deeper, letting the hole take shape, letting the work confirm what she had already sensed. The earth changed as she went down, becoming denser, cooler, less responsive to the shifting air above. She noticed the difference immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition. It was then that the comments began in earnest, not unkind, not sharp, but persistent. A man from the neighboring claim paused at the edge of her yard and asked what she planned to build. She answered that she was preparing for winter. He looked at the hole, then at her, then back at the hole, and nodded as though filing the information away under something he did not yet understand. Another neighbor asked if she would not prefer a structure closer to the house itself. She replied that this was close enough. There were no arguments, only glances exchanged once her back was turned. Day by day, the hole grew. It did not resemble a cellar or any recognized feature of frontier life. It was simply there, unmistakable and increasingly difficult to ignore. The woman worked alone, pausing only when necessary, covering the opening at night and uncovering it again in the morning. She did not rush, even as the days shortened. The earth accepted her pace without complaint. While she dug, she continued her other preparations. Supplies were sorted and set aside. Small tasks were completed with the same quiet care she gave the larger one. Nothing about her routine suggested uncertainty. If anything, it suggested confidence, though not the kind that announced itself. She did not speak of plans. She did not defend them. She allowed the work to exist as its own explanation. By the time the hole reached its intended depth, the air had changed noticeably. Mornings were colder, and the sun no longer carried the same authority it had weeks before. The woman adjusted her movements accordingly, but her focus did not waver. She lined the interior carefully, not in a way that invited comment or inspection, but in a way that satisfied her sense of order. When she was finished, she placed the prepared supplies inside, closed the opening, and covered it completely. From a few steps away, there was little to see beyond disturbed soil, soon hidden by the season's first fallen leaves. The neighbors noticed the absence as much as they had noticed the digging. Some expected further work, some kind of structure or marker. None appeared. The ground was smoothed, the surface left plain. Whatever had been done there was now invisible, and that invisibility made people uneasy in a way they could not quite articulate. Still, no one pressed her for answers. There was time yet, they told themselves. Winter had not fully arrived. The first frost came without spectacle, silvering the ground overnight and retreating again by midday. Then came another, and another, each one lingering a little longer than the last. The settlement adjusted, as it always did, moving inward, conserving effort, measuring the day by what could still be accomplished before the light faded. The woman followed the same outward rhythm, but something about her manner remained unchanged. She did not check the ground she had worked so carefully. She did not linger near it or mark it in any way. It was as if that part of her preparation had already moved beyond the need for attention. By late autumn, the wind carried a sharper edge, and conversations shifted accordingly. People spoke less of what they planned to do, and more of what they hoped would hold. The woman listened, as she always had, and went about her days without comment. When the ground finally hardened at the surface, locking the season into place, she paused once, standing near her door and looking out across the land. Then she went back inside, leaving the quiet question she had planted in the earth to wait for its answer. Winter did not arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, almost politely at first, as if giving the land time to reconsider its position. The days shortened, the sun traced a lower path across the sky, and the air took on a clarity that made distant objects appear closer than they were. Frost became a regular presence, no longer a visitor, but a resident. The settlement adjusted without ceremony, drawing inward as it always did, each household retreating into its routines and assumptions. From the outside, little seemed different. From within, everything was tightening. The woman felt the change as keenly as she had felt the shift into autumn. She rose later, conserved movement, and measured her work carefully against the daylight available. Her preparations had ended weeks earlier, and now there was nothing left to add, only to live with what she had chosen. She did not revisit the ground in front of her home except when necessity required it. When she did, it was briefly and without hesitation, the motion practiced and unremarkable. To anyone watching, it would have seemed as though nothing unusual were happening at all. Around her, the rhythms of the settlement began to show strain. People spoke more often about their supplies, checking and rechecking what they had stored. Small adjustments were made. Coverings shifted. Containers moved from one place to another in the hope that a better position might improve their chances. These were not signs of panic, only of awareness. But awareness has a way of growing heavier as conditions narrow. The woman noticed these changes in passing, in the tone of voices, and the frequency of visits across the space between claims. She did not comment on them. The first extended cold period arrived in early winter, lasting long enough to test patience, without yet demanding answers. Days passed when the temperature did not lift appreciably, and the ground remained hard from morning to night. Movement slowed across the settlement. People stayed closer to their homes, venturing out with more purpose and less inclination to linger. The woman's routine did not change. She maintained her pace, her movements economical and deliberate. When she needed something, she went to it and returned. No more and no less. As the season deepened, small differences became easier to notice. Some neighbors began their mornings by inspecting what they had stored, adjusting coverings or shifting items to protect them from the cold. Others spoke openly of uncertainty, not dramatic, but persistent. The woman did not join these conversations. She greeted those who passed by, exchanged brief words, and returned to her tasks. The ground she had prepared remained quiet, unremarkable, doing its work without calling attention to itself. The hardest part of winter did not announce itself with a storm or a sudden change. It arrived as a continuation, a stretch of days that blurred together under the same conditions, each one reinforcing the last. The cold held steady, neither worsening nor easing, and that steadiness wore on people more than any dramatic shift might have. It was during this time that the settlement began to notice her more closely, not because she said or did anything new, but because she did not seem to be adjusting in the ways they were. People watched without meaning to. They noticed that she did not make repeated trips to check her supplies. They noticed that her movements remained measured, that she did not carry the tension others had begun to show. These observations were not shared immediately. They formed quietly, one by one, until they accumulated into something like curiosity, stripped of judgment. The laughter and casual remarks that had followed her digging in autumn did not return. Instead, there was a silence that carried more weight. Eventually, questions came, though not all at once. A neighbor paused longer than usual during a passing conversation and asked how she was managing. She answered simply that she was doing well enough. Another remarked on how the winter seemed to be settling in. She agreed and said nothing more. These exchanges were brief, offering no explanations and inviting none. Yet they marked a shift. People were no longer speaking at her, but to her, and the difference was subtle but unmistakable. At the heart of the winter, when the cold had become an accepted fact rather than an event, one of the neighbors came directly to her door. It was not a visit born of desperation, but of reconsideration. He did not bring tools or offer advice. He asked instead whether she would mind if he looked at how she had arranged things. She considered the request for a moment, then stepped aside. The visit was quiet, free of commentary. He observed, nodded once or twice, and left without asking further questions. Word of the visit spread without embellishment, carried by the simple fact that it had happened at all. From that point on, the change in the settlement was gradual but clear. People no longer spoke of her earlier actions with amusement or doubt. They spoke of them, when they spoke at all, as something to be considered. She did not correct misconceptions or clarify details. She allowed others to draw their own conclusions, knowing that conclusions reached through observation lasted longer than those offered freely. When winter finally began to loosen its hold, it did so reluctantly. The cold retreated in increments, leaving behind days that hovered between seasons. The ground softened at the surface, though it remained firm beneath. The settlement emerged cautiously, assessing what had endured and what had not. The woman moved through this period, as she had through the rest, without commentary or display. Her preparations had met the season, and the season had passed over them without incident. Spring arrived not with relief, but with activity. As the earth opened again, people began to alter their surroundings in small but telling ways. New holes appeared near existing homes, placed with more thought than imitation. Each one reflected the individual who dug it, shaped by personal judgment and circumstance. The woman observed this quiet transformation, without claiming credit or offering guidance. She answered questions when asked, but briefly, allowing others the space to learn as she had learned, through attention and patience. By the time the land fully shifted into the new season, her decision from the previous autumn had ceased to be remarkable. It had become part of the settlement's understanding, absorbed without ceremony. Life continued, as it always did, shaped by choices made earlier and revealed only when tested. The woman returned to her routines, the ground in front of her home now indistinguishable from the rest, its purpose fulfilled without leaving a mark. The winter had answered the question she had placed there months before, and she accepted the answer without comment, already attentive to the season that followed. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel. More frontier stories like this are coming, each one focused on quiet decisions that shaped survival and everyday life. You can also explore other videos on the channel, where we document practical knowledge, lived experience, and lessons drawn from the past. If this story resonated with you, sharing it helps these histories reach others who value thoughtful storytelling. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.